All right, it is 6:30, so I'd like to call this meeting to order. We do have 7 of the 8 council members with us this evening, and my understanding is Councilmember Inman will not be joining us. So I will turn this, we have one topic on the agenda, and I will turn this over to Laura Smith.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm going to pull up a presentation here quickly. Okay. So this evening, I wanted to take the opportunity to just talk a little bit about the city's classification and compensation system and some potential consideration for an update and refresh of that. So I thought we would start with just kind of some information about why classification compensation system and structure is important. Obviously, we, like all other organizations, depend on our employees for success in delivering our programs and services. Employee compensation is the single largest expense in our budget each year. In 2021, general fund salaries and benefits were approximately $7.9 million, or 60% of our overall general fund expenditures. And that's actually trending a little bit on the low end from where we've been at different times in our previous history. And it is a system and a structure that requires strategy and planning to make sure that we can approach it in an organized and consistent manner. So what does that structure compensation plan do, or what is it intended to do for us? First and foremost, it can help us attract qualified candidates when we have position vacancies, particularly in a metropolitan area. Competition for local government employees at any level in the organization is pretty competitive. And so we want to make sure that we get a good look as candidates are considering opportunities on both sides of the state line and all sizes of different governments. It also helps us retain our higher performing employees when coupled with our performance evaluation and merit increase system that we have in place. It can help reduce an employee turnover. It helps employees see the avenue for their own growth and professional development within the organization. We know that we are a small entity and that sometimes those promotional opportunities are somewhat limited when compared to a larger employer, but the compensation structure helps us communicate and potentially show a path for those employees as we look at succession planning and professional development. And then it really helps provide a systematic method for evaluating both the external or market conditions and internal equity questions. And so internal equity is when we look at how our positions compare or are classified with respect to one another within the organization. And that's always a tricky and challenging system. There's no perfect classification or compensation system that I've been able to unearth in nearly 30 years of this profession. But the goal is for us to really look to make a system that is as fair as possible and relatively easy to administer. One of the biggest challenges in any classification and compensation system, particularly in a small organization, is that we have to continually remind ourselves and our employees that the focus is on the job, not the actual individual employee in that position. And so we're looking at equity and fairness from that perspective, not individual employee performance. That's recognized, as I mentioned, through our merit and performance evaluation system. Just a little bit of history about where we are and where we've been, because I always think that's important to help provide some context as we think about decisions for the future. But immediately prior to 2005, which is when I first became employed by the City of Mission, there was no formal system or structure that existed. Essentially, as I understood it, each department was set their own pay ranges, and you might have a pay range that went from $10 to $10,000 or something. There was no consistency, no specific or set methodology necessarily. And so the city hired Springstead to conduct a comprehensive classification and compensation study. And that was done and implemented in 2005. And that created a consistent salary structure. It created new position or job descriptions for each of our classifications or jobs. And it recommended a strategy that salary ranges would be adjusted by CPI annually as a way to kind of keep up with the market. And I can tell you that was something that was done very consistently in the early years following the implementation of the 2005 study. And over the time period within which that happened, there were some years in which the entire range structure would move by almost as much as 5%. And there was one year actually where CPI was negative, and so the ranges were moved downward in that particular year. So it's an easy, clear, CPI is an easy measure to point to and look at that range movement, but it doesn't necessarily, unless you're looking at a variety of other things, necessarily solve the challenges or opportunities that you may have. So we were adjusting salary ranges by CPI annually, and any employee who fell below a range minimum was moved to the minimum of that range, but we didn't make any additional adjustments for employees who fell within the newly adjusted range with their current salary to keep employees spread out. So what was happening over time in areas like the police department and the public works department in particular, where you have multiple employees in the same classification, so police officer, public works crew member, the range movement was actually creating and compounding compression adjustments because the range, just imagine the minimum of the range would move by 5%. And so an employee, let's say that was hired in 2008, had started at the minimum of a range the year before, got a decent merit increase, but then the range moved 5%, and an employee that was hired in that particular calendar year came in some cases was making more than the employee who had been here for a year. So that compression was occurring particularly in the police department, and then again was also compounded by a salary freeze that was implemented for all employees from 2009 to 2012. So the ranges were still moving, but the employees were not getting merit increases, and there was no movement within the ranges. So kind of as we came out of that time period, we did some catching up, and then we realized it was really probably long overdue or past time for us to look at kind of a classification and compensation system refresh. Now, also sort of, it's important to remember at that time that there were a lot of competing priorities in the budget. It was back in 2010 when we had the very intentional drawdown of general fund balance that took us well below our 25% fund balance goal or policy. And so really every dollar that we were able to have each year where revenues exceeded expenditures was being dumped back into rebuilding of that general fund balance. So certainly impacted the ability to look at things like a broader classification and compensation study. It impacted equipment replacement and a variety of other things. So we kind of moved into 2016 and 2017. We had reached that point where we had successfully rebuilt our general fund balance, and we had some flexibility and opportunity to look at going back and addressing some of those other things that had kind of been put on a back burner for years. So in 2017, we issued a request for proposals for a comprehensive classification and compensation study. Again, looking at, similar to the 2005 study, an external market analysis, a review of all of our positions, a rework and a redo of all of our position descriptions, and a look at potential compression adjustments and a compensation philosophy. Ultimately, we contracted with the Austin Peters Group to complete that study, and that was done over the course of about a 6-month period through a series of surveys with other cities and our market competitors, individual employee questionnaires and interviews to make sure that they had a complete understanding of the job and the requirements of the jobs and our positions. When they came back to the City Council in July of 2017 and presented their study results, their market analysis indicated that Mission's salary structure or ranges was competing at just below 40% of the market here in the Kansas City metropolitan area. And so what that meant is that there were 4 employers that were paying less than we were, and 6 employers that were paying generally more than the city of Mission. So we had a lot of conversation around compensation philosophy, and that market target obviously is based on the resources available to the organization to dedicate to salary or classification and compensation, and kind of community values and where you perceive you want to be in that market. And so ultimately at that time, the council passed a resolution and adopted a compensation philosophy to look at competing at 60% of the market. And in order to do that, at that time, we looked at both range adjustments and the compression adjustments necessary to keep employees appropriately spread out within their ranges. It was something that we implemented in steps and phases, and ultimately the overall impact to base wages and then other salary related benefits like CAPERS, KPNF, and the like, it cost the city approximately $187,700 to implement the recommendations out of that study in 2017. And we impacted not 100% of the employees in the organization, and that's typical. When you conduct these studies, you will find that some people are being paid where they need to be paid within their ranges. A lot of that depends on sometimes where they were hired in. And oftentimes, because of our size, most of our positions, there's only one employee in that position. And so the compression issue only happens in a couple of places throughout our organization. So that was the 2017 study results and recap. And we looked at what opportunities we had to continue to kind of watch the ranges. We've done kind of a high level overview and analysis of the market ranges since 2017. We have not moved the ranges, typically because CPI was lower in some cases. We had quite a bit of turnover in some of our departments. And so we were keeping an eye on the overall system and structure, but haven't made any specific adjustments to that. As we kind of reached the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, it really felt like it was time to go out and do a little bit more detailed market analysis. One of the things, although we were not adjusting the ranges, we were really working to make sure that the merit increases that were provided to our employees were at or above sort of what our competitors in the metropolitan area and among our other cities we're looking at, and that coupled with 2 years in a row now of no increases in health insurance premiums for employees allowed, I think, employees to have a much more significant impact to their take-home pay as a result of our performance evaluation system. So originally we planned to look at and do a limited engagement with the Austin Peters group again in early 2020, but then obviously that was put on hold because of the pandemic and the situation that we were moving into last March. But one of the things that ideally you want to take kind of a more in-depth look at your classification and compensation system probably every 3 to 5 years. We'd gone between 2005 and 2017. Was way too long to have gone without taking that deeper dive into the system. But again, I think there were some other contributing factors that were at play in that situation. So reached back out to Austin Peters Group in the fall of 2020 and asked them to look at that market analysis, and as well as just looking at the compression analysis again. The other thing that happens and that sort of drives this on a continual basis is that the cities, particularly in Johnson County, are very good about keeping their systems updated. So in any given year, there are probably 3 or 4 other communities in the county that are looking at and reviewing their classification and compensation systems and making range movements. So when you set a compensation philosophy to be a certain percentage of the market, and the market is continually moving, sometimes by larger leaps and bounds, that another reason why you want to kind of look at that more frequently so that you are keeping up. So when we asked Austin Peters Group to kind of look at that evaluation again this last fall, we asked them, because of kind of the continued revenue declines that we were seeing as a result of COVID, we asked them to evaluate our structure both at 50% of, or at the 50th percentile of the market and the 60th percentile of the market. Now, some might say, why move away from a compensation philosophy that was adopted by the council? But I think as we kind of move through this presentation, we wanted to be sensitive to the current financial situation. And so we wanted to be able to really be able to articulate and discuss with you all kind of those options. I think now with the confirmation that we will get American Rescue Plan Act funding, I think it provides some flexibility in the 2021 budget that we hadn't originally anticipated to consider moving forward with implementation of this. In addition, as we walk through some of the other reclassifications and structural changes, there are some other things that we'd like to get moving that will allow for us to, particularly in the police department, begin to fill and consider some promotions. So tonight is just kind of an introduction, looking at general questions, discussion, hoping for some consensus around the structure so that we can bring back some recommendations with respect to funding either in May or June. I think it's still too premature, in my opinion, to implement, for example, next month. I would prefer to have a couple more months of sales tax collection under our belts this year, just to make sure we're tracking the way we think we will be. So as I mentioned, and as the Austin Peters Group study that was included in your packet referenced, they would recommend and recognize a need for both range adjustments and compression adjustments. In addition to that, they recommended 2 reclassifications, and then there are several other reclassifications which were outlined in the memo, which we'll discuss in detail. But basically, position reclassification is the assignment of a new grade profile to an existing position. And a reclassification can go in either direction for a position. So a position can either have additional duties and responsibilities, the scope of that position, the level of authority or autonomy that's afforded to that position can change. Those can either increase or decrease, and those are appropriate times at which to look at that reclassification. And some of that is done as a part of the market analysis work that Austin Peters Group does. And they survey specifically, and it's not just a written survey instrument, but they actually do phone follow-ups and phone surveys to make sure that we're getting as close to an apples-to-apples comparison to our positions in those peer cities or competitor cities. And they, as you saw in the memo, recommended reclassification of the accountant's position, a move from a grade 11 to a grade 12, and a reclassification of the planner's position from a grade 16 to 17. So external market can also impact kind of that reclassification or range movement for a position. In addition to the ones that were identified through Austin Peters Group work, there are some additional reclassifications that are being recommended at this time. The first is to reclassify the assistant to the city administrator's position as an assistant city administrator, reflecting the addition of supervisory responsibilities for municipal court and a variety and supervisory responsibilities for the human resources function, and just an increase of additional duties and responsibilities that have transitioned to that position. The court clerk, we have typically or historically had 3 court clerk positions. The recommendation is to look at transitioning one of those existing court clerk positions to a lead court clerk. And although the assistant to the city administrator does provide kind of overall supervision of municipal court, what we've found is that it's important to have kind of that, boots on the ground every day, working in that arena position that can help provide some supervision, some guidance, and really to help ensure that all of the court clerks are being consistently cross-trained and able to support and meet the needs of the court patrons. And then the other position reclassification is the creation of, or taking one of the public works crew leader positions and converting that to an assistant public works superintendent's position. The public works crew leaders positions were created a couple of years ago to provide sort of more in the field supervision. As we have kind of worked with the new structure and under Celia's direction in the Public Works Department for the last year and a half or so, what we're finding is that the time that the Public Works Superintendent needs to be spending in the office and not in the field, supporting many of the other activities that are priorities, is taking away from that time in the field. And so this is a request that had been made by the department we think supports the field operations more effectively under this structure. And then again, the accountant and planner reclassifications that were recommended through the Austin Peters Group study. So I'm going to stop briefly there and see if anybody has any questions, because the next couple of slides will move into some discussion about changes that Chief Madden is looking at in our police department structure. And I suspect there'll be lots of conversation around some of those, but this is kind of a natural stopping point if anyone has a question or comment here.
Laura, I had one question about retention. If I'm remembering correctly, when the 2017 changes were made, one hope was that moving from 40% of market to 60% of market would have a big positive impact on retention. And so I was just wondering how that's played out.
I think that the issue where we were seeing, and Chief, jump in here if you think I'm incorrect, but I think as I look at it, one of the biggest drivers then was we were losing, particularly in the police department, as we had officers who were reaching kind of that 5 to 7 year tenure with our organization. We had a wave, and you'll recall, I think it was back in 2017, 2018, where we had kind of an exodus of about 7 employees within that time frame. I would say, I think, Chief, correct me, but I don't think we've lost anyone kind of in that tenure in the last, since we implemented the 2017. So I think we've seen good results from that in our police department.
Okay.
Again, I think that the other place where we were, and I'm not sure it was as much a salary issue, where we've historically had the greater retention issues, has been in just the public works field positions, crew positions. I know that we finally reached a point in maybe the last 8 years or so that we were fully staffed there. And so we're hoping that with some of these other structural changes and some of the things we're doing, I think we've seen some turnover, and we're hoping that we'll see some of that impact there. I think turnover overall in the organization it's been about average. And I don't feel like, it's always interesting. I mean, you lose people for a variety of different reasons, but I do feel like in the area that we were most concerned about, the work that we did in 2017 has had a very positive impact.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Thanks, Laura.
Laura, I had a question.
Yes.
In the changes that we've already made in the previous years, what and just rough estimate, what is the average that we saw in the increase of the salary grade for I guess just every employee? I'm wondering, is a 6th grade increase, is that normal, or is that something we've seen before, or only with a title change?
I don't. I think as we look at the 6th grade, are you talking about assistant to the city administrator
I didn't know in regards to the other increases that we had given, if that was normal, or if it was just like what the average was.
That I will tell you is probably larger than average, but it is primarily a reflection of that position functioning. So that grade 29 is then representative of the other department director positions that we have. So Parks and Recreation Director, Public Works Director. And this position is now, and honestly, for some time has been functioning really at that level of a department director, and particularly with the direct supervisory responsibility. So one of the things that changed, and one of the transitions, was that prior to her retirement last year, our city clerk was actually supervising municipal court. And so following that retirement, we made that transition in supervisory responsibility. So we actually reclassified and restructured some of the duties away from the city clerk's position, and those were absorbed into the assistant to the city administrator's position. And this is just kind of our first opportunity to talk about a formal reclassification. So yes, I think 6 grades is probably one of the biggest jumps you might ever expect to see, but it is probably one of the biggest transitions of shift of responsibility and scope that has occurred in the organization.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question, Laura.
Sure.
Thanks. With the title changes that are coming, I believe, to Brian and Emily, which exciting for them, guys, and well deserved. I was hoping that maybe we could get a job description rewrite of some sort when you're at that point, to help
Yes.
give some clarity on what the responsibilities are. And then also just in chain of command, having a deputy city administrator and an assistant city administrator. I'm just curious how that structure goes in terms of succession, et cetera.
Well, it's whoever draws the short straw if I have to be out of town.
Sounds about right.
Is that fair? We let Brian and Emily arm wrestle for it. I think that, as I think was laid out in the memo, part of the transition to and some of it is you have to really unravel and pull the threads back several years. But if we think about it, Brian serves currently as the assistant city administrator / finance director. And although I don't think it's on his business card, technically also the director of community development. So just in terms of scope and sort of breadth of areas of operation and scope of authority, it seems appropriate to transition that position to the title of deputy city administrator. That work with the budget and some of those other things. And if you look at our current salary structure, that position is currently 2 grades above the other department director's positions. So there's been a separation for some time in that position, which is why you saw the recommendation for just a title change, title change only. And so I think it's just really, there's a lot of sort of divide and conquer the way we've functioned really with the current titles and structure. I think you've seen Emily probably steps in more just the availability with kind of packet support and packet preparation, meeting hosting, some of those kinds of things. So again, I part of it is I don't think we're, large enough organization for that really clear succession plan, but certainly in terms of, experience and breadth and scope and authority, that's why you're seeing the reflection in the recommendations at this point.
Laura, I have a quick question. Because you're actually changing the structure of the position, we are not going to be looking for another assistant to the city administrator position, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Laura, go ahead, Ken.
Can you kind of go over table 1 in terms of the respondent survey? My question has to do with the fact that we're trying to remain competitive with other cities in Johnson County. And the cities in Johnson County have different sizes. So the scope of responsibility varies just by the size of the city themselves. Can you talk a little bit about the peer cities as you see it, as well as the cost of living index that's being referred to in column 3 of that table?
Yes, give me just a minute to flip to that. So I know one of the things, that we did in the 2017 study, and I think it's a factor that Austin Peters Group will look at, as well as we oftentimes will sort of pull out a subset and just sort of double check against that subset. Because you're right, there is wide variety of size between a unified government or an Overland Park or Johnson County when compared to the city of Mission. Now, the challenge is that sometimes that makes a difference and sometimes it absolutely does not make a difference. Where I would tell you that it makes a difference for us is probably our ability to compete for, mid-level, upper-level management positions versus, a police officer's position, a public works crew position, a parks and recreation programmer type position. So it's important, I think, to have them because we do have the opportunity to lose our employees to those larger organizations. So making sure they're at least factored in and that we can remain somewhat competitive helps us from that retention perspective. Again, sometimes we will lose employees to the larger organizations because there are more opportunities for promotion and growth and development for them. So that's why we do include those entities in our peer group study. But we do take a step back and look at and make sure that we're not, inflating that 60% of the market necessarily because we've got those larger employers in there. And so again, then Austin Peters Group is then also using that cost of living data to make some of those adjustments for size between our peer entities. And I can certainly get some additional information on that as we move forward with specific implementation recommendations.
Yeah, I guess my question has to do with, is there kind of an escalation factor that's going on in regards to trying to be competitive with one another and each city raising and then having the effect of raising it all over the region?
Yes, I can tell you that's absolutely the case. And again, I think part of that is what everybody feels like they need to do to be able to compete and attract qualified candidates in their positions. But it does feel like a never-ending cycle to a certain extent. And we do talk about that frequently in our managers meetings and our networking meetings. There was a lot of conversation, 3 or 4 years ago with the competition for police officers in particular. People not only were they making adjustments to their salary structure, but they were looking at hiring bonuses and all sorts of things to sort of pull the best candidates because the applicant pools were, somewhat limited.
Okay,
Laura,
thank you.
Oh, Laura, I had one other question, and maybe we'll get to this after the police part when you're talking about the models. But I noticed that the APG report said that a lot of our current salaries would stay within the range, even if the range itself moves. So is the biggest piece the financial impact that would be expected in connection with new hires rather than, current workforce?
No, and we will get, I think that'll be a little bit clearer when we get through the police structure, and then I'll talk about kind of ballpark budgetary implications and how that will play out. I do have some preliminary percentages on the number of employees that would be impacted and moved, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Laura, could you, I think an important piece of this conversation is also the discussion about the number of department heads and where we have trended over the past few years. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've actually trended downward in terms of the number of department director positions that we had. In fact, at one point, probably back in 2011, 2012. We had not a total of 9 department directors. So, and now we have a total of 6 on the leadership team. So we've been, looking over time at readjusting and reallocating responsibility. So what has happened is we've had some elevation and reclassification of some other positions in the organization. But if you think about 9 department directors for a city our size, that it seemed as if we were a little top heavy. So we've worked to kind of pull that back. I don't know that we have the balance exactly right. Yet again, it sort of is somewhat dependent on projects and priorities and goals and objectives, of the city council and the things that you need and want to accomplish. But we have, pulled back the number of top management positions over time.
Laura, another
Mhm.
question as a follow-up to that. Where do you see and maybe this is a conversation for a later day, but where do you see the gap currently existing in terms of your needs? If, you're looking at, Emily's title change, Brian's title change, do you envision, something else, coming down the pipeline in terms of needing more support for you in the admin role?
I think I think I would say, and I think Brian would agree, I think the biggest question in my mind, and I think some of this may be answered, as we come out of some of the visioning work that we're doing around the comprehensive plan. One of the things that we haven't seen slow down is the, redevelopment activity in the community. And so just with kind of a continued emphasis on and one of the things I forgot to mention, kind of that, Brian, in most instances is wearing the hat on most of the larger IT projects, for the organization. So I think that community development role and that IT somehow looking at a balance there would probably be the next conversation or the things that we're evaluating, and those would come forward as we have kind of more information around that.
Laura, can I ask one real quick question? I'm not seeing on the graph the HR personnel. What are they under?
They are a payroll and
Benefits specialist?
benefits specialist. Yes,
And we have 1 or 2?
we have 1.
Thanks.
Laura, one more question.
Sure.
At what point do you say, okay, this function really can be done as a contract service as opposed to a hire and an employee service?
Well, I think we are continually evaluating the opportunities that we have to privatize or use contractors for the work that we do. So it's difficult to say, there's a particular or specific tipping point. I think we just really have to start to evaluate, the amount of time that's spent in a particular area or on a particular project. Part of it is, what are you, one of the things that I think will always be a challenge for us because of our size is that there is a lot of flexibility and fluidity in terms of the work that you do on a daily basis, particularly for anyone who's working in a mid to upper level kind of management position in the organization. And so I think it's part luck, part art, part, I don't know what, to kind of find that what is that really delicate balance between too many employees, too few employees. How do we create enough skills, or how do we maintain, the right skills with the folks who can sort of, change on a moment's notice and accomplish, work in a little bit different area. So it would be great to have unlimited, revenue source and be able to, hire people specifically for projects or to get things done. And that's just not the environment that we'll probably ever live in. I think we're doing a better job of tracking and thinking about how and where we're spending our time as we think about reallocation of positions or requests to add positions. I think, what you saw was we've had a city planner's position in the past. And then that work sort of shifted and changed. And, you saw the addition of the planner's position. It was removed and then it was brought back in the budget when we felt like we could make the case and demonstrate the need for that. So I think the position evaluation for us is kind of every time we have a position vacancy, we have a conversation around, do we need this position here, or is there another area that we can, sort of transition those resources toward? You've seen Penn do it recently in the Parks and Recreation Department with a maintenance position where we shifted the emphasis of that position from indoor facility maintenance at the community center to outdoor park maintenance, hoping to be able to, use that same budgeted position to positively impact and move the needle on a priority that, has been established not only by council, but by staff as well.
I was also wondering, like, in situations like with the animal control, where we are providing services to multiple other jurisdictions, is there any possibility of looking at that in relationship to certain sectors of work, having as a consortium with other cities that would provide that kind of support for functions?
I think we could. I think we can always be creative. I know we've talked in the past. Sometimes we've talked about and explored opportunities for sharing building officials. We do, some of the IT work. I don't know, I think there's opportunities for improvement there, but we do some of that through an, arrangement with another, government, DTI or the county. So I think we explore those. I think we're certainly open to looking at and trying to find the best ways to stretch those dollars.
Well, I was specifically also thinking about this development role. Is that sporadic, or is it steady kind of activity that goes on? And to what degree if it is sporadic and it requires that expertise, is there some way to look at that as a contractual role as opposed to an employee role?
Yeah, and I think we can run through we do that. I think I know that was some of the work and the data that was collected in making the case for the creation of the building officials position, or bringing that in-house versus, contracting. And the name of the company escapes me at the moment, but I think, we watched kind of the expenses until we could, and the consistency, because there have been periods of time when the development activity wouldn't necessarily support. And that was one of the main reasons we looked to the contractual arrangement with the county, is because we didn't feel like we could support a position on a full-time basis. But I know that was a lot of the research that Brian did in making the recommendation to make the building officials, bring the building officials position in-house. And I think that's one that we've been able to keep more than occupied.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Okay. Are we ready to move to police? Yes, if so, then I'm going to turn it over to the chief. And if he will just let me know when he wants me to change slides, I can be responsible for that.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Excited to be before you tonight. Been waiting for the opportunity to explain kind of where I'd like to take the department and the reasons why. As we looked at developing rank structure, one of the main things that I focused on was looking at where we're at as a department and knowing that, as police officers with 25 years in, you can retire at age 50. It's not mandatory by any means, but it's definitely something. Retirements are coming earlier and earlier throughout the country. So what I wanted to do is look and see that every one of our sergeants or above would be eligible for retirement within the next 5 years, which made me really focus a rank structure on professional development, making sure that we create the leaders of tomorrow within our organization, give them the opportunities here to learn and have additional responsibilities as their careers progress. So on top of that, wanted to make sure that that responsibilities align with the position. So for example, this rank structure calls for the elimination of the corporal rank and moving, not elimination, but a restructure of moving corporals into a sergeant's role. And one of the reasons that is important is because corporals do the role of a sergeant currently. But they're somewhat marginalized in that position because they still have the sergeant that is the shift commander, essentially. So, whereas right now it's almost looked at as a corporal is only there to cover a sergeant's days off, it somewhat marginalizes their authority as well as alignment with other law enforcement agencies because we work with, all of the agencies that surround us fairly regularly. And it just brings us more into line with what the roles of those sergeants are. So it really empowers them to take more responsibility. Also, through some of these movements, it will create just natural professional development to prepare us. A lieutenant rank, for example, will have a significant number of administrative responsibilities and tasks that will assist in their development, both up and down. So the way I would look at it now is a lieutenant would be there to cover the sergeant's days off instead of a sergeant there to cover a lieutenant's days off. And this will, again, improve the ownership and accountability as you progress through the structure. And I think I'm ready for the next slide, and it will just illustrate the structure that proposed. As you know, the prior rank structure had a chief, 3 captains, an investigations captain, a staff support captain, and a patrol captain. In an effort to make sure that we could focus on the professional development, I wanted to focus that on the lower level management. So now you would see a chief, and it goes down to a major, or you call it deputy chief, major, whatever the case may be. Now there's be a definitive second in command with 3 captains. I can tell you firsthand, it was kind of the situation that Laura was talking about earlier about drawing the short straw as to who's responsible. In this model, there's no question about who the next person in line of succession is. So that person would have direct oversight over investigations and staff support and patrol. So they essentially take over all day-to-day functions of the department as far as making sure that everyone is, doing their job, doing it effectively, making sure we're looking for opportunities of improvement throughout the rank structure. So really eliminated a lot of the upper end management. Then those would go down to a lieutenant, which again, anybody that's currently a sergeant would be reclassified to a lieutenant. And that provides them the opportunity to be involved in more administrative tasks, such as emergency management and involvement in the budgeting process, internal affairs and fleet maintenance, all of those things that often aren't thought about in the operation of the police department. So bring them in to develop them to take on additional responsibilities. But also on the patrol side, lieutenant, their responsibilities would also include things like doing kind of off-the-cuff tabletop exercises, as staffing allows or as call load allows, meeting a couple people from the shift at a business and saying, okay, we just got a call here and this is what's happening. What are we going to do? Just really working through some of those things to develop the officers and just, it just builds on each other as the ranks progress. So the other opportunity that I see is, on the administrative side of the department in staff support and investigations, but particularly staff support, that's an area that has very little to do with what you would think of traditional police work. They're the ones that are making sure that we're compliant with the regulatory issues with KCGIS and NCIC and Regis and the KBI and the Attorney General's office and all those things that you don't really think about that make us be able to operate. So it's important that we have a sergeant in that position so they too get the development of learning how the internal aspects that make the police department work. And in what we would do is that sergeant position, while it's a promotion, it's not a static assignment. Now I rotate the sergeants through that position each year. That way every sergeant has the opportunity to get that exposure. They will do some things with investigations because while that is still, traditional police work, there are a lot of intricacies and things that occur on the investigative side that are important for them to understand and have knowledge about as they progress through their career. The other change in this that we would make is with the patrol captain, what we would think of, currently as Captain Lane. Currently his role is 100% administrative. Well, this leaves the patrol captain still functioning in the patrol division as a shift supervisor on the day shift. So they would still maintain, patrol operations and not solely be sitting in an office to handle those tasks. So because we'll have the opportunity with the lieutenants to bring them into more things, it allows us to continue to keep that person having a patrol role. Excuse me. So with the detectives would stay the same. They would have a sub-supervisor and 2 detectives. One of the things that we'll evaluate as we move along is because I think we've seen some benefit from the rotating detective position that we've had as they go back to patrol. They've been able to be more effective and impactful and teach some of the other officers some of those intricacies that investigations brings and really take that knowledge back to their position as a patrol officer. Excuse me. So really continuously evaluate kind of the caseload and what's going on in that position as for detectives, because cases are increasingly becoming more intricate and involving multiple agencies and computers and cell phones and all of those things that take a significant amount of time to get conclusions on. So that, and as you know, we are the only department that operates 24/7, 365. So it takes these people, between days off, vacation, the training requirements, and the things that we have to do to make sure that we're providing good officers on the street and making sure they get time off with their families and vacations. So it takes a lot of people to accomplish those things. And I think with this, we add even more officers on the street, while at the same time just increasing that professional development and the opportunities. And one of the other, you'll notice in the salary structure, there's a police officer 1 and police officer 2. And one of the things that we will be looking at formalizing is a police officer 2 position that will have the ability to step in as a supervisor should the need arise, and really formalize that process. So that just continues the development of the officers into their next role as supervisor as well. So I believe, I think I've hit all the highlights. See if you guys have any questions.
Chief, let me hop in real quick, because I think I just want to make a comment, and maybe you can elaborate on this just a little bit more. So I think what this org chart represents, currently when the council authorized the addition of the directed patrol unit, we went from total sworn staff in the department from 29 to 31. And I know that we have committed to, and is reflected in this organizational chart, that we aren't showing those 30th and 31st positions that were added into the authorized budget in the form of the DP, directed patrol unit. So those have been pulled out. And I think as we've talked about with you all over the course of the last 9 months to a year, that we would not be looking to add those back in without absolutely much more specific, budgetary conversations and evaluations of that. What you see reflected on this org chart, when you look on the patrol side, you'll see that there's an officer/detectives box that is yellow. That represents an additional position vacancy at this time. And so while budgeted, it is vacant, and we left it shown as vacant because I think the chief will tell you there's other things he's kind of continuing to evaluate. But as you look at that patrol side and the shifts, I would like, if you wouldn't mind, Chief, for you to just kind of elaborate a little bit more on the 3-shift structure, kind of what our shift staffing minimums are, and why we look at those minimums, and then talk a little bit about kind of that bottom line that shows some of that coverage and that overlap, which I know is intended to address peak call periods, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as you might remember during the interviews, one of the things that I probably said way too many times ad nauseum was the looking at data and making sure we're using that to make decisions. Well, the officer spots that you kind of see at the bottom in the middle represent that, not as a 1-for-1 necessarily, but just to show that, traditionally we have had day shift, evening shift, and midnight shift. And those have been very strictly followed guidelines that, it doesn't make sense to follow when you look at our data. So as you look at schedules and shifts, there is really more of a hybrid system in place now to account for the heavier call times, which for us tends to be in the evening, in the early evening until the early hours of the morning, especially on the weekends. That's when, you see more domestic disturbances. You get more theft calls. You get, more alcohol related calls and DUIs. So really taking a look at where that call load lies and allocated resources where we need them the most. Now, we do have to maintain minimum shift coverage, and that is mostly for safety. In our minimum coverage is 2 officers and a supervisor. We'll continue to evaluate that, and there are times that might need to be adjusted downward, and after the 3 or 4 o'clock hour, we probably go with just 2, but I don't want to schedule it like that. But I think that if there was a time period that we could afford it, it might be that period of time. But we always like to have the 2 officers or 2 officers and a supervisor for the safety of the officers. We can get one domestic disturbance call can take 2 officers several hours. If you have to transport somebody to jail, if you have to transport somebody, or go follow up at a hospital, and you're at minimums, all you have left in your city is your supervisor. Did a little research on trying to figure out where at our current staffing over 2019, 2020, we averaged to be on minimums about a third of the time, roughly, as we are at minimum staffing. And again, that's due to training and days off, vacation, military leave, family leave, all those things that come into play with any department or employer for that matter. So that's where we like to be, because it gives our officers some safety in knowing that there's, generally speaking, we always have 3 officers on that can help and take calls and make sure we're available to serve the public, because it's important for their, because of the nature of some of the calls that they go on. It's automatically 2 officers. So that's where we're at with the minimum staffing requirements on shift.
And so
Chief-
currently you have you have a North Patrol District and a South Patrol District. And so your goal is, and I know one of the things that we've been talking about and looking at, trying to start collecting or compiling data more effectively, is looking at periods of blackouts when potentially we do not have an officer available to respond to a call, immediately, because that's something else that can help us indicate whether we've got kind of these staffing levels established appropriately. But so part of what you're trying to accomplish is officer safety, as well as making sure that you have someone that is available to just basically be visible in your neighborhoods, right? So if you're continually responding and your day or your shift is spent going from one call to the other, I think they actually have a name. I think it's call fatigue syndrome, where you just are not able to be present, and visible in the neighborhoods. And I know that's one of the things that gets surveyed through the direction finder, is just sort of the public's perception or desire for more visibility of, officers just routinely patrolling neighborhoods. So that's another factor in that, 3 shift minimum, I think.
Right. And, we definitely encourage the patrolling of neighborhoods and any other, hot spots. And as we move into more of looking at where the data tells us we need to be, really being able to allocate the resources to those areas while still maintaining the same levels in the neighborhoods.
I have a question. Two things. One, you have a north and south district. What is the business district part of? Is it a part of one or the other districts, or does it have a separate district of its own?
Generally speaking, if we just have a north district and a south district, the dividing line is Johnson Drive. And the reason for that is, since Johnson Drive is a well-traveled thoroughfare, that means if that's a border of each person's district, it's getting covered, multiple times, because each side of the road is in each district. So that's how it's divided now. If we have staffing available and we have a business district car, and generally speaking, the business district runs, throughout the entire city, east to west, but the border is basically Mart Way to 58th Street.
Okay. And the other question I have is when you have a minimum and you have a situation where there's an overwhelming requirement, do you have on-call then that can be brought in?
Well, we will call if there's a critical incident that we know is going to take a while. We will start making phone calls and bringing people in early for their shifts. We rely on outside agencies to assist, for short periods of time until we can recover. And likewise, we oftentimes go assist outside agencies when they're in need. So there's nobody that's specifically on call, but it's kind of understood that you could get called in, and we're gonna, try to get volunteers first and then order it last. But usually when there's something going on, the officers are really good about understanding that they need to come in and get there as soon as possible. But, that still takes some time for them to, alter whatever they were doing and come into work and get prepared, get dressed and all of that stuff.
Is the reciprocity with other jurisdictions pretty even in terms of the assistance?
Do we need more assistance, or do we give more assistance? Is that your question?
That's my question.
Okay.
I would say it's probably pretty equal. We do end up, we do assist Overland Park a lot, just because of the, up on their very far north end. And, we're oftentimes a lot closer to an active incident than they are. They come help us from time to time, but mostly it's the agencies that are on our radio frequency. So Roland Park, Fairway, Westwood, Merriam, because we can hear everything and we know what's going on. It provides a little bit better opportunities for us, especially when you talk about communication.
Thank you.
Ann, I have a quick question or a comment, if you will. I appreciate what you're doing with the force. I think you're doing an amazing job. I also was really excited to hear the emphasis placed on the police being out in the neighborhoods, because we're still having a really big problem on Johnson Drive with people speeding. And I hate to repeat that. There's no blame whatsoever, but I wish we had some way of being able, maybe once a week, to do some tallying along Johnson Drive to find out why people think they can speed through this community.
Well, with that new speed sign, we're going to try to move it down in an area that we can get some decent data. But the officers have spent a lot of time and written a lot of citations along Johnson Drive. And the goal in that is to alter people's behavior. And the more people see that the officers are out there with their lights on, have a car stop, maybe hopefully next time they'll think twice about speeding through. So I think as we loosen up our restrictions, people are still a little hesitant to on both ends. You know, officers are a little hesitant to stop cars for everything. They still do it, of course, but also the people that they're stopping are can be sometimes a little hesitant as well. So it's kind of a balancing act right now, but we are definitely out there on Johnson Drive a significant amount of time, and have I'll shoot you a screenshot of that crime map showing all the traffic stops we've done on Johnson Drive in the last couple of weeks, so you can get an idea of how much activity there has been.
Well, that's excellent. I think with the weather getting warmer too, I think it's probably going to get worse. So
Right.
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Dan, the only other thing I might ask is that I totally lost my train of thought, so it'll come back to me. Well, no, can you talk a little bit to kind of, and as we move through some of the other dollar impacts, but some of what you perceive as the more immediate need to make some decisions about the positions in your department, so you can look at those promotional opportunities and what you have kind of tied or targeted for that, and then somewhat generally, as we continue to look at the right sizing and the staffing for the department, which your department or anybody else's department, that we look at that. Is this kind of a rank structure that you see surviving, at least if there were any potential changes coming in the future?
Sure. So it's really important for us to be able to move forward as soon as possible. As you recall, right before Chief Hadley left, Captain Self left. So that took our command staff down to Captain Lane and I. So all of those other responsibilities that were being shared with so many others have kind of remained the same throughout since August of last year, which is really slowing down some of the progress that we'd like to make with some of our community engagement efforts and preparation for those, and being able to get people in the positions to kind of spread out the workload in a way that allows us to just move forward and move forward with the goals and objectives that we want to do with the community and outreach as things open up. But that requires planning and consideration. But so the faster that we can get on track with the rank structure, the better off that we're going to be in providing the services that we really think are important to the community. So, that to me, that is really important, because like I said, I just feel like we're treading water constantly without being able to make a lot of progress on the things that I think are really important.
Well, I think that
Dan, I have a question. In your chart here, where does the head of internal affairs lie? Is it the lieutenant in the detective column?
It traditionally would be, but I think that too, again, is something that I'm going to look at when I think about the allocation of other lieutenants. As that would be our currently Sergeant Mike Palmieri, that would be in that role. He's already been doing those for a while. So just try to evaluate whether it makes sense for one of the other patrol lieutenants to take on some of those tasks, to develop their skills and their understanding in some of those areas as well.
Well,
Yeah.
Traditionally, internal affairs has to be placed high enough in the organization. And it looks like we're lowering it in the organization. So I guess, can you explain? I mean, you want to have it high enough to make sure it has the respect it needs to do the job it needs to do.
Right. And, even at the lieutenant rank, there'd be, three 3 persons above that, and which still leaves, 90% of the department almost under their umbrella. And, as you know, I did internal investigations for a long time, and I did those. Some of those started when it just a detective position. So the structure of that is that the internal affairs commander, regardless of rank, reports directly to the chief and doesn't have to utilize the chain of command in a traditional way.
Okay.
Chief, I had a question about the positions we're reclassifying up. It sounded like there's maybe a combination of people who are already performing the duties that would fit that classification, and then some growth into the role and that professional development piece. So I guess from a day one readiness perspective for this kind of model, are you just thinking there'll be greater, you'll go ahead and put people into those slots, but there'd be greater mentorship and at the beginning, or how are you envisioning that part?
Well, as we sit here right now, everybody in orange that's a sergeant is currently a corporal. Literally the only function of a sergeant that they do not perform currently is that of approving time cards in our payroll system. Everything else, they do the same exact role as a sergeant, but they just don't have as much experience. But what we've seen is when you have a sergeant and a corporal on the same shift, it really mitigates the effectiveness and the abilities of the corporal, because they really don't have any authority except for the days that they're covering for the sergeant. So it will allow them to really take ownership of their shift and run it as their own, while still having oversight from a lieutenant's position. But also that lieutenant's going to be busy doing things that are upward for their development at the same time.
Okay, and so it would then allow for some more of that shift flexibility. Is that the idea that you were talking about?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
And so if there's administrative tasks that need to occur and there's sufficient staffing on supervision, then we can make those adjustments. It allows us to be very flexible with scheduling, and and we'll also potentially reduce some overtime costs as well.
Okay, great.
Chief, I think that, one of the things I'm very pleased that you have this concept of trying to build growth within the organization. In terms of the application for these positions, are these individuals going to be applying for the promotion, or do you have a sense of who would be taking, for instance, the major role versus the lieutenant roles?
So anybody who is currently a corporal will be reclassified to a sergeant. Anybody who's currently a sergeant would be reclassified to a lieutenant. There would be a promotional process for the patrol captains that all of the current sergeants, or then lieutenants perhaps, would be eligible to participate in that promotional process. And then the major is a reclassification from captain. Since we only have one captain at this point, that's just a reclassification. So the promotions that would exist after making the changes would be that of detective, that of sergeant, and one sergeant and one captain.
Thank you.
So will we have an idea somewhat comprehensively for budget purposes, all of the promotions that'll go through with the outgoing of the corporal, what that will entail for the budget?
Yeah, Laura and I, we're going to work through that and see what it looks like, so we know exactly what implications it might have. You know, one of the things about this is that the positions, with the exception of one of the corporals for sure, but several of these people have been here for, you know, lengths of time, as you would find in supervision. So they're already up into their pay ranges significantly. So, you know, I don't think the budgetary hit is going to be as significant as it might look when you're looking at that number of people changing ranks. I don't think.
Okay, thanks.
Are we ready to move on to kind of budgetary impacts? Okay. Let me see if I can move. Okay, so again, these costs are still preliminary, but I think get us in the right sort of range for our discussion purposes. So as we talked about earlier this evening, I asked the Austin Peters Group to look at both estimated costs for moving us to the 50th percentile of the market and then the 60th percentile of the market. I think staff's recommendation is to try to get as close to the 60th percentile as we can to keep us aligned with the compensation philosophy that was adopted back in 2017. But as you can see, again, we ask for that 50th percentile and 60th percentile consideration as a result of the COVID impacts that we were seeing on revenues. So, and you can see there's a pretty significant difference between that move between 50th percentile and 60th percentile. So to get us to the 50th percentile with both a market adjustment and compression adjustments, we're looking at approximately $660,000 impact to base wages, with an estimated impact to approximately 60% of our staff. Now, one of the things as we move forward, we'll do a much deeper analysis of, and if you were here in 2017 and saw those study results, we broke that down not only by department, but we broke that down so that you could sort of see the impact for those, I believe both with, you know, based on tenure with the organization as well as the salary grades. So, and we were impacting more significantly those in the lower salary grades and classifications, which is certainly an important impact or goal of this study. So in both, and so at the 60th percentile, that impact is about $110,000 to base wages, and we see that impacting about 67% of the staff. It's split, those impacts, those financial impacts are split fairly equally in both cases between market adjustments or, you know, movement to range minimum as a result of that, and then the compression adjustment. One of the primary reasons that these are sort of still preliminary is, you know, we'll be looking for some kind of council consensus or direction with your comfort with the reclassifications. Right now, we believe that any of the reclassifications that we've identified would certainly be included in these estimated totals. So it's not going to be in addition to the work that the Austin Peters Group has done. But I think one of the things that, you know, if we have some agreement around the structure, what that allows me to do is, you know, as I mentioned, no classification compensation system is perfect. So I still need to sit down and break down each department when we have, you know, kind of when all of the parts and pieces stop moving, and look at those impacts to make sure that we aren't creating compression issues when we adopt these study recommendations. And, you know, what I will do is I will sit down with each department and look at the specific impacts to their department employees. And one of the things I will tell you that I think is at least a preliminary indicator is looking at the Public Works Department. So again, we've had relatively high turnover and new employees with not a lot of tenure in that department. And that is also a range that would be moving. And so I think one of the things that we factor in, again, we have the flexibility to kind of look at implementation strategies. And so in 2017, one of the things that we looked at was we capped any individual employees increase at 10%. So there were very few employees who were by the study results due an increase over 10%, but we felt like a 10% increase was a very significant increase in any one given year. So we want to sit. So I will run specific percentage increases to look to see if it's appropriate to look at a cap in that instance, as well as perhaps there's an opportunity to say that you don't get a compression adjustment if you have, if your tenure with the organization is less than a certain period of time. Again, there's some other strategies that will help us keep employees spread out appropriately in those ranges. And so the next step, if I know which percent of the market is my target, I can come back with those more specific dollar amounts.
Laura, I had a question.
Yes.
Are these estimates based on the old police department structure or the new police department structure?
They're based on the old police department structure, but I don't think there's going to be enough of a change that it will dramatically impact that. Again, I think when we're talking about, when we look at the new structure and the actual kind of tenure of the people in those positions and where they are currently in their salary ranges, it's not going to be wildly different.
Okay. But we won't know that until later.
No, so if we're comfortable with this structure, I mean, we can sort of very quickly move into that. And if I'm absolutely wrong, I mean, and unfortunately, what you don't know is we can do some sort of assignment of the reclassifications. What we don't know is specifically if we open up a promotional process, which employee might be selected for that promotion, right? But I think those differences will be minimal in the grand scheme of all of this.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking it's a little hard to say without seeing that, but if you're saying it's minor amounts, then that makes more sense in terms of the overall 60,000 or 110,000, is minor, like a $5,000 to $10,000 range, or we don't really know.
I think, and what I can do is if this evening we can leave with kind of a direction, and if we're leaning towards 60th percentile, then I can kind of run some scenarios based on the new police department structure and come back or provide that information back. And if it's over, it's a threshold that you're not comfortable with, we can certainly, come back and revisit that, or that, can become part of that implementation strategy. Mm-hmm. Or you can also look at, we had the opportunity originally back in 2017, we were going to phase implementation over 2 budget years. And we were able, with just some of the attrition that happened and some other factors, to be able to actually implement the full impact of that study in a 1-year time period. So that's the other thing. We can look at spreading out the implementation of this over, more than 1 fiscal year, if you will.
Laura, I would say that if it really has an impact on competitiveness in the marketplace, that we stay with the prior concept of 60 percentile. To me, the $50,000 change, if it's going to cost you more to have to replace people and have vacancies than it is, in my mind, the impact on this particular base wage.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
yeah,
that feedback.
I would second that. I think staying competitive in this market, and we're seeing a little bit of an upward push in the market, but I think staying competitive and really working to retain the great staff that we have is going to be really important. So I would also agree at trying to stick towards that 60th percentile.
Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
like to add to that too. Just I think that makes sense, especially considering some of the hard to find skills that some of these positions require. The more folks we can keep under our umbrella, the better. So yeah, I'm good with that too.
Same.
Same.
Okay. I think my last slide we've already talked about. Generally, thoughts on police department structure?
I did have one question still, maybe to Chief Madden still. So kind of on the mayor's question on the internal affairs position. So I guess I didn't fully take away. So does that position report directly to the chief going forward in the new plan, or did it report to the new major?
Well, ultimately, internal affairs always reports directly to the chief.
Okay.
As far as reporting. That doesn't mean that the chief is the disciplinarian at all times. It's just the chief, given the nature of internal affairs, you want your top executive to look at that and review all of those internal affairs reports to make sure that investigations are complete, thorough, and appropriate. So that's kind of why you see that's why you see that responsibility goes straight up to the chief and kind of subvert the typical chain of command.
Okay. Thanks.
I had a question. So our community, our DARE officer, is that an officer who is strictly for that position, or does that officer also patrol or do a number of other tasks?
That position is currently, it's kind of what we have now with Jay Flair. They do have some responsibilities with patrol, but they also have responsibilities with community. And, with scheduling, try to, anytime they have the ability to kind of not be subject to call unless it's an emergency, the more opportunities we'll have to engage with the community. So that's kind of the thinking on that. They are there for times that we fall below minimum staffing, but their primary role and function would be that of making sure that we're making connections with the community and through our social media and things like that.
Okay. I think I've seen like a list of events and things that our community officer does. And I was wondering if there was a need for an additional, or if he even had enough time to help with patrol or whatever that case may be, because you had mentioned training and vacation and all those other things. So I wasn't sure how well that fit into one officer's schedule.
Well, he does a really good job of balancing the two. And I might be able to give you a better answer after we actually get to have community events and all of those things. So, if, as with anything, we'll continue to evaluate all of the services that we provide on top of, the additional services we provide to the community on top of just traditional police services. So, if there may be a time that we do look at, really pulling that person away from patrol if it warrants it. But right now, especially, he serves primary duties as in patrol just due to the situation with the pandemic.
Okie doke. Thank you.
Yeah, Laura and Chief, I just wanted to say, I like this plan. I still want to see what the numbers end up being, but I think it makes a lot of sense, both in terms of flexibility and sort of cultivating people to grow into positions. Seems like good idea.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think with that direction, I can pretty quickly turn around, and confirm some of those numbers and make sure that, that we're in a comfort level. And so really that next step is then to allow me to do that, and then to also be able to come back to you and say, okay, if we're ready to implement, what is the time horizon, when this year potentially do we want to do that, and then we'll show you the path of how we pay for that. And so I think most of, if not all of that, plus can be accomplished within what we traditionally recognize as savings in our personnel line items, particularly with, holding those DPU positions that were included in the budget vacant. Can assist with that, but there are also other position vacancies. So we'll get to work on that and report back to you all in pretty short order, if that's okay. All right, great. Thank you. I appreciate your time this evening, and you get to have next Wednesday off since we have 5 this month.
I know
Happy spring.
you get to have next Wednesday off. Lucky you.
Actually, I don't think I do. I don't know what I have going on, but I think I have something next Wednesday. So.
Cancel it.
Great overview, Laura. Great
Yeah.
overview. That was
Thanks.
really good. Thanks, Dan.
All right.
Good job.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you all. Have a good evening.
Guys.
You too. Bye.
Bye.